Letter 1, Historia Calamitatum. Abelard to a friend, the story of his misfortune. There are times when example is better than percept for stirring or soothing human feelings, and so I propose to follow up the words of consolation I gave you in person with the history of my own misfortunes, hoping thereby to give you comfort in absence. In comparison with my trials, you will see that you own are nothing or only slight, or will find them easier to bear. I was born on the borders of Brittany, about 8 miles, I think, to the east of Nantes, in a town called La Palette. I owe my volatile temperament to my native soil and ancestry, and also my natural ability for learning. My father had acquired some knowledge of letters before he was a knight, and later on his passion for learning was such that he intended all his sons to have instructions in letters before they were trained to arms. His purpose was fulfilled. I was his firstborn, and being specially dear to him, had the greatest care taken over my education. For my part, the more rapid and easy my progress in my studies, the more eagerly I applied myself, until I was so carried away by my love of learning that I renounced the glory of military life, made over my inheritance and rights of the eldest son to my brothers, and withdrew from the court of Mars in order to be educated to lap of Minerva. I preferred the weapon of dialects to all the other teachings of philosophy, and armed with these, I chose the conflict of disputation instead of the trophies of war. I began to travel about in several provinces, disputing like a true peripatetic philosophers, where I had heard there are keen interest in the art of dialects. At last I came to Paris, where dialectic had long been particularly flourishing, and joined Williams of Champeaux, who at time was the supreme master of the subject, both in reputation and in fact. I stayed in his school for a time, but though he welcomed me at first, he soon took a violent dislike to me because I set out to refute some of his arguments and frequently reasoned against him. On several occasions I proved myself his superior in debate. Those who were considered the leaders among my fellow students were also annoyed, and the more so as they looked on me as the youngest and most recent pupil. This was the beginning of the misfortune which have dogged me to this day, and as my reputation grew, so other men's jealousy was aroused. It intended by my setting my heart on founding a school of my own, young as I was, estimating my capacities too highly for my years. I had my eyes on the site of suited to my purpose, Melun, an important town at that time and royal residency. My master suspected my intention, and in the attempt to remove my school as far as possible for this on before I could leave him, he secretly used every means he could do to thwart my plans and keep me from the place I had chosen. But among the powers in the land, he had several enemies, and these men helped me to obtain my desire. I also won considerable support simply through this unconcealed jealousy, though my school had its start and my reputation for dialect began to spread. With the result of that, the fame of my own old fellow students and even that of the master himself gradually declined and came to an end. Consequently, my self-confidence rose still higher, and I made haste to transfer my school to Corbeil, a town near Paris, where I could embrace him through more frequent encounters in disputation. So you remember this Corbeil, this is the place near to Paris. However, I was not long before I fell ill through overwork and was obliged to return home. For some years, being remote from France, I was sought out more ardently by those eager of instructions in dialect. A few years later, when I had long since recovered my health, my teacher William, Archdeacon of Paris, changed his former status and joined the order of the Canons Regular, with the intention, it was said, of gaining promotion to a higher prelacy. Though the reputation for increased pity, he was soon successful when he made a bishop of Chalons. But this change in his in way of life, did not oblige him either to leave Paris or to give up his studies of philosophy, and he soon resumed his public teaching in his usual manner in very monastery, to which he had retired to follow the obliged of religious life. I returned to him to hear his lectures on rhetoric, and in the course of our philosophic dispute, I produced a sequence of clear logic argument to make him amend, or rather abandon, his previous attitude to universal. He had maintained that in the common existence of universal, the whole species was essentially the same in each of its individuals, and among these there was no essential difference but only variety due to multiplicity of accidents. Now he modified his views in order to say that it was the same not in essence but through non-difference. This has always been the dialectician's chief problem of concerning universal, so much so that even prophecy did not venture to settle it when deal with universal in Issa Gouge, but only mentioned it as a very serious difficulty. Consequently, when William had modified or rather been forced to give up his original position, his lectures fell into some contempt that he was scarcely accepted on any other positions of dialect, and is who whole subjects rested solely on the question of universal. My own teaching gained so much prestige and authority for that the strongest support of my master, who had hitherto been the most violent among my attackers, now flocked to join my school. Even William's successors, as head of the Paris school, offered me his chair so that he could join the others as my pupil, in the place where his master and mine had won fame. Within a few days of making over the teaching of dialects, William was eaten up with jealousy and consumed with anger to an extent it is difficult to convey, and being unable to control the violence of his resentment for long, he made another artful attempt to banish me. I had done nothing to justify his acting openly against me, so he launched an infamous attack on the man who had put me in his chair. In order to remove the school from him and put in the hands of one of my rivals, I then returned to Melun, set up my school there as before, and more I jealous pursued, and more widely my reputation spread, for, as the poet says, envy seeks the heights, the winds sweep the summit. This is page number 6. But not long after, he heard that there was considerable doubt about his pity against the majority of thoughtful men, and a good deal of gossip about his conversion, and it had not led to his departure from Paris. He removed himself and his little community, along with his school, to a village some distance from the city. I promptly returned to Paris from Milan, hoping for peace henceforth from him. But since he had filled my place there, I said, by one of my rivals, I took my school outside the city of Mont Saint Genevieve, set up the camp there in order to lay siege to my usurper. The news brought Williams back to Paris in unseemly haste to restore such school as remained to him and his community to their former monastery, apparently to deliver from my siege the knight whom he had abandoned. But this good intention did the man very serious harm. He had previously had a few pupils of sort, largely because of his lecture on precision, for which he had some reputation, but as soon as his master arrival, he lost them all and had to retire from keeping a school. Soon afterwards, he appeared to lose hope for future worldly fame, and it too was converted to the monastic life. The bout of argument which followed William's return to the city between my pupil and him and his followers, and success in these battles which fortune gave my pupil, myself among them, are facts which you have long known, and I shall not go too far if I boldly say with Ajax that, if you demand the issue of this fight, I was not vanquished by my enemy. Should I keep silence, the fact cry out and tell the outcome? Meanwhile, my dearest mother Lucy begged me to return home, for after Father Berengar entry into monastic life, she was preparing to do the same. When she had done so, I returned to France with special purpose of studying divinity, to find my master William, whom I have often mentioned, already installed as Bishop of Chalon. However, in the field in his own, master Anselm of Laon was that the greatest authority because of his great age. I therefore approached this old man, who owed his reputation more to long practice than to intelligence or memory. Anyone who knocked at his door to seek an answer to some question went away more uncertain than he came. Anselm could win the admiration of the audience, but he was useless when put to the question. He had a remarkable command of words, but their meaning was worthless and devoid of all the senses. The fire he kindled filled his house with smoke, but did not light it up. He was a tree in full leaf which could be seen from afar, but on closer and more careful inspection proved to be barren. I had come to this tree to gather fruit, but I found it was the fig tree which the Lord cursed, or the ancient oak to which Lucan compares Pompey. They stand the shadow of a noble name, like a tall oak in a field of corn. Once I discovered this, I did not lie idle in his shade for long. My attendance at the lecture gradually became more and more irregular, to the annoyance of some of his dealing pupils, who took it as sign of contempt and so great a master. They began secretly to return him against me, until their base insinuation succeeded in rousing his jealousy. One day it happened that after succession of sentence, we students were joking amongst ourselves when someone rounded me on me and asked what I thought of reading of the Holy Scripture. When I had hitherto studied only philosophy, I replied that concentration on such reading was most beneficial for the salvation of soul, but that I found it most surprisingly that for educated man, the writing or glosses of the fathers themselves were not sufficient for the interpreting their commentaries without further instructions. There was general laughter, and I was asked by many of those present if I could or would venture to tackle this myself. I said I was ready to try if they wished. I still laughing. They shouted, right, that settled. Take some commentary on a little known text as well. We will test you what you say. Then they all agreed on an extremely obscure prophecy of Ezekiel. I took the commentary and promptly invited them all to hear my interpretation, and the very next day they then pressed unwanted advice on me, telling me not to hurry over something so important but to remember my experience and give longer thought to working out and confirming my exposition. I replied indignantly that it was not my custom to benefit my practice, but I relied on my own intelligence, and either they must come to my lecture at the time of my choosing, or I should abandon it altogether. At my first lecture, there were certainly not many people present, for everyone thought it obscure, and I could attempt this so soon, when up to now I had made no study at all for the scriptures. But all those who came approached, so that they commanded the lecture warmly and urged me to comment on the text on the same lines as my lecture. The news brought people who had missed my first lecture flocking to the second and third ones, and all like most eager to make copies of the glosses which I had begun with on the first day. And Slim was now widely jealous, and being already set against me by the suggestions of some of his pupils, as I said before, he began to attack me for lecturing on the scriptures in the same way as my master William had done previously, or philosophy. There were at this time two outstanding students in the old men's schools, Alberic of Rome and Lotuf of Lombardy, whose hostility to me was intensified by the good opinion they had of themselves. It was largely through their insinuation, as was thereafter proved, and Anselm lost his head and curtly forbade me to continue my work of interpretation in the place where he taught, on the pretext that any mistake which I might write down through lack of training in the subject would be attributed to him. When this reached the ears of the student, their indignation knew no bound. This was an act of sheer spite and calumny such as had never been directed at anyone before. But the more open it was, the more it brought me and persecution my fame increased. A few days after this return to Paris, to the school which had long ago been intended for an offer to me, and from which I had been expelled at the start, I remained in possession there in the peace of several years, and as soon as I began my course teaching, I set myself to complete the commentaries on Ezekiel which had started at Laon. These proved so popular with their readers that they had judged my reputation to stand as high for my interpretation of the scripture as it had previously done for the philosophy. The number in the school increased enormously as the students gathered the eager for the instruction in both subject and wealth and fame. This brought me must be well known to you. But success always puffs up fools with pride, and worldly security weakens the spirit's resolutions and easily destroyed it with through carnal temptation. I began to think myself the only philosopher in the world, with nothing to fear from anyone, and so I yielded to the lust of the flesh. Hitherto I had been entirely continent. But now, the further I advance in philosophy and theology, the further I tell behind the philosophers and holy fathers in the impurity of my life. It is well known that the philosophers, and still more the fathers, by which it meant those who have devoted themselves to the teaching of Holy Scripture, were specially glorified by their chastity. Since therefore I was wholly enslaved to pride and lechery, God's grace proved a remedy for both these evils, though not one of my choosing. First, for my lechery, by deprived me of those organs with which I practiced it, and then for the pride which had grown in me through my learning. For in the words of the apostle, knowledge breeds conceit. When I was humiliated by the burning of the book of which I was so proud. So this statement you please remember. For in the words of apostle, knowledge breeds conceit. Knowledge breeds conceit. This is a powerful statement. Knowledge breeds conceit. Okay. The true story of both these episodes I now want to know from the facts in their proper order instead of from hearsay. I had always held myself aloof from unclean association with prostitutes, and constant applications to my studies had prevented me from frequenting the society of gentlewomen. Indeed, I knew little of the secular ways of life. Perverse fortune flattered me, and saying goes, and found an easy way to bring me toppling down from my pedestal, or rather, despite my overbearing pride and heedlessness of the grace granted me, God's compassion claimed me humble for Himself. There was in Paris at the time a young girl named Eloise, the niece of Fulbert, one of the canon, and so much loved by him that he had done everything in his power to advance her education in letters. In looks, she did not rank lowest, while in the extent of her learning, she stood supreme. A gift of letters is so rare in woman that it aided gently to her charm and had made her most renowned throughout the realm. I considered all the usual attractions for her love and decided she was the one to bring to my bed, confident that I should have an easy success. At that time, I had youth and exceptional good looks, as well as my great reputation to recommend me, and feared no rebuff from any woman I might choose to honor with my love. Knowing the girl's knowledge and love of letters, I thought she would be all the more ready to consent, and that even when separated, we could enjoy each other's presence by exchange of written message, in which we could write many things more audaciously than we could say them, and so need never lack the pleasure of conversation. All the fire with desire for this girl, I sought an opportunity to getting know her through the private daily meetings, and so more easily winning her over. And with this end in view, I came to an arrangement with her uncle, with the help of some of his friends, whereby he should take me into his house, which was very near my school, for whatever sum he liked to ask, and pretext I said that my household cares were hindering my studies and the expense was more than I could afford. Fulbert dearly loved money and was moreover always ambitious to further his niece's education in letter, two weaknesses which made it easy for me to gain his consent and obtain my desire. He was all eagerness for my money and confident that his niece would profit from my teaching. This led him to make an urgent request which furthered my love and fell in with my wishes more than I had dared to hope. He gave me complete charge over the girl so that I could devote all the leisure time left me by school to teaching her day by day and night, and if I found her idle, I was to punish her severely. I was amazed by his simplicity. If he had entrusted a tender lamb to a ravening wolf, it would not have surprised me more. In handing her over to me to punish as well as to teach, what else was he doing but giving me complete freedom to realize my desire, and providing an opportunity, if even if I did not make use of it, for me to bend her to my will by threat and blows of persuasion failed. But there were two special reasons for this freedom from base suspicion: his love for his niece and my previous reputation for continuance. Need I say more? We were united first under one roof, then in her heart. And so, with our lessons as a pretext, we abandoned ourselves entirely to love. Her studies allowed us to withdraw in private and as love desires, and then, with our books open before us, more words of love than of our reading passed between us, and more kissing than teaching. My hand strayed often to her bosom, then to the pages. Love drew our eyes to look on each other more than reading kept them in our text. To avoid suspicion, I sometimes struck her, but these blows were prompted by love and tender feeling rather than anger and irritation, and were sweeter than any blame could be. In short, our desires left no stage of love making untried, and if love could devise something new, we welcome. We entered on each joy the more eagerly of our previous experience, and whether less easily stated. Now the more I was taken up with these pleasures, the less time I could give to philosophy, and then a less intention I paid to my school. I was utterly boring for me to have to go to the school, and frequently wearisome to remain there and to spend my days on study when my nights were sleepless with the love making. As my interest and concentration flagged, my lecture lacked all inspiration, were merely repetitive. I could do no more than repeat what had been said long ago, and when inspirations did come to me, it was for writing love songs, not the secrets of philosophy. A lot of these songs, as you know, are still popular and sung in many places, particularly by those who enjoy the kind of life I led. But the grief and sorrow and laments of my students, when they realized my preoccupation, or rather distractions of mind, harder to realize. Few could have failed to notice something so obvious. In fact, no one, I fancy, except the many whose honor was most involved. Elias' uncle. Several people tried on more than one occasion to draw his attention to it, but he could not believe, because, as I said, of his boundless love for his niece and my well-known reputation for their chastity in my previous life. We do not easily think ill of those whom we love most, and the taint of suspicion can't exist alone with warm affection. As the remark of Saint Jerome in his letters to Sabinian, we are always the last to learn of evil in our own home, and the faults of our wife and children may be at the talk of the town but do not reach our ears. But what is last to be learned in somehow learn it eventually, and common knowledge can't easily be hidden from one individual. Several months passed, and then this happened in our case. Imagine uncle grief at the discovery, and the lover's grief too at being separated. How I blushed with shame and contrition for the girl's plight, and with sorrow she suffered at the thought of my disgrace. All our laments were for another trouble, and our distress was for each other, not for ourselves. Separation drew our heart still closer, while frustrations inflamed our passion even more. Then we became more abandoned, as well lost all sense of shame, and indeed shame diminishes as we found more opportunities for love making. And so we were caught in the act, as the poet says, happened to Mars and Venus. Soon afterwards, the girls found that she was pregnant, and immediately wrote me a letter full of rejoicing to ask what I thought she should do. One night, then, where her uncle was away from home, I removed her secretly from his house, and we had planned, and sent straight to my own country. There she stayed with my sister until she gave birth to a boy, whom she called Astrolabe. On his return, her uncle went almost out of mind. One could appreciate only by experience his a transport of grief and mortification. What action could he take against me? What traps could he set? He did not know if he killed me or did me personal injury. There was the danger that his beloved niece might suffer for it in my country. It was useless to try to seize me or confine me anywhere against my will, especially as I was very much on guard against this very thing, knowing that he would not hesitate to assault me if he had the courage or the means. In the end, I took pity on his boundless misery and went to him, accusing myself for the deceit, love, and made me commit as if it were the beset treachery. I begged him his forgiveness and promised to make any amends he might think fit. I protested that I had done nothing unusual in the eyes of anyone, had known the power of love, and recalled now since the beginning of human race woman had brought the noblest man to ruin. Moreover, to conciliate him further, I offered him satisfaction in a form he could never have hoped for. I would marry the girl I had wronged. All I stipulated was that the marriage should be kept secret so as not to damage my reputation. He agreed, pledged his words and that of the supporters, and sealed the reconciliation I desired with a kiss. But his intention was to make it easier to betray me. I set off at once for Brittany and brought back my friend to make her my wife. But she was strongly opposed to the proposal and argued hostilely against for it two reasons: the risk involved and disgrace to myself. She swore that no satisfaction could ever appear her uncle, as subsequently found out. What honor could she win? She protested from the marriage which would dishonor me and humiliate us both. The world would just exactly punish me from her. She removed such a plight for it admits. Think of the curse, the loss to the church, and grief of philosophers which would greet such marriage. Nature had created me for all mankind. It would be sorry scandal if I should bind myself to single woman and submit to such base servitude. She absolutely rejected this marriage. It would be nothing but a disgrace and burden to me. Along with the loss to my reputation, she put before me the difficulties of marriage, which the Apostle Paul exhorts us to avoid when he says, "Has your marriage been dissolved? Do not seek a wife. If, however, you do marry, there is nothing wrong in it, and if a virgin marries, she has done no wrong. But those who marry will have pain and grief in this body life, and my aim is to spare you again. I want you to be free from anxious care." But if I would accept neither the advice of the apostle nor the exhortation of their father on the heavy yoke of marriage, at last she argued I could listen to the philosophers and pay regard to what has been written by them or concerning them on this subject. As for the most part, the fathers too have carefully done when they wish to rebuke us. For example, St. Jerome in the first book of Against Jovinian recalls how Theophrastus sets out in considerable detail an unbearable annoyance of marriage and its endless anxieties in order to prove by the clearest possible argument that a man should not take a wife. And he brings his reasoning from the exhortations of the philosophers to this conclusion. Can any Christian hear Theophrastus argues in this away without a blush? In the same joke, Jerome goes on to say that after Cicero had discovered Terentia and was asked by Heretius to marry his sister, he firmly refused to do so on the ground that he could not devote his attention to a wife and philosophy alike. He does not simply say devote attention, but adds alike, not wishing to do anything which would be rival to his study of philosophy. But apart from the hindrance to the philosophic study, consider, she said, the true condition for a dignified way of life. What a harmony can there be between pupil and nursemaid, desk and cradle, books or tablets and distaff, pen and stylus and spindles. Who can concentrate on thoughts of scripture or philosophy and be able to endure babies crying, nurses soothing them with lullabies, and all the noisy coming and going of man and woman about the house? Will he put up with the constant muddle and squalor which small children bring into the home? The wealthy can do so, you will say, for their masons, and the large house can provide privacy, and being rich they do not have to count the cost nor be tormented by daily cares. But philosophers lead a very different life from rich men, and those who are concerned with the wealth or are involved in the mundane matters will not have time for claim of scriptures or philosophy. Consequently, the great philosophers of the past have despised the world, not renouncing it so much as escaping from, and have denied themselves every pleasure so as to find peace in the arm of philosophy. The greatest of them, Seneca, gave this advice to Lucilius: philosophy is not a subject for idle our moments. We must neglect everything else and concentrate on this, for no time it is long enough for it. Put it aside for a moment, and you might as well give up. For once interrupted, it will not. Now, page number 15. This is at the time of 14 a minute, page number 15. We must resist all other occasions, not merely dispose of them, but reject them. This is practiced today through love of God and those among us who truly deserve the name of monk, as it was of the distinguished philosophers among the pagan in their pursuit of philosophy. For in every people, pagan, Jew, or Christian, some men have always stood out of their faith or upright way of life, and have cut themselves off from their fellow because of their singular chastity and austerity. Amongst the Jews in time past, there were Nazarenes who dedicated themselves to the Lord of according to the law, and son of the prophet, followers of Elijah's or Elisha, whom the Old Testament called monk, as Sir Jerome bears witness. And in more recent time, the three sects of philosophers described by Josephus in the 18th book of Antiquities. The Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. Today we have the monk who imitate either the communal life or the apostle or the earlier solitary life of John. Among the pagan, as I said, are the philosophers, for the name of wisdom or philosophy used to be applied not so much to acquisition of learning as to religious way of life, and we learn from the first use of the word itself and from the testimony of the saints themselves. And so St. Augustine in the 18th book of his City of God distinguished between types of philosopher. The Italian school was founded by Pythagoras of Samos, who is said to have been the first to use the term philosophy. Before him, men were called sages if they seemed outstanding for some praiseworthy manner of life. But when Pythagoras was asked his profession, he replied that he was a philosopher, meaning a devotee or lover of wisdom, for he thought it too presumptuous to call himself a sage. So the phrase, if they seemed outstanding for some praiseworthy manner of life, clearly proves that the sage of pagan, that is, a philosopher, was so called as tribute to their way of life, not to their learning. There is no need for me to give example of their chaste and sober lives, so I should seem to be teaching Minerva herself. But if pagan and layman could live in this way, though bound by no profession of religion, is there not a greater obligation on you as clerk and canon not to put base pleasure before you sacred duties, and to guard against being sucked down headlong into his Charybdis, there to lose all sense of shame and be plunged forever into whirlpool of the impurity? If you take no thought for the privilege of the clerks, you can at least uphold the dignity of the philosopher, and let a love of prophecy curb you shameless. If the reverence due to the god means nothing to you, remember Socrates' marriage and the sordid episode where he did at least remove the slur it cast on philosophy by providing an example to be warning of the successor. This too was noted by Jerome when he calls this tale of Socrates in the first book of Against Jovinian. One day after he had withstood an endless stream of invective, which Xanthip poured out from a window above his head, he felt himself soaked with dirty water. All he did was to wipe out his head and say, "I knew that thunderstorm would lead to a rain." Alois went on to risk I should run in bringing her back, and argued that the name of friend, Amica, instead of wife, would be dearer to her and more honorable for me. Only love freely given should keep me for her, not the constriction of a marriage tie. And if we had to be part for a time, we should find the joy of being together, all the sweeper and rare. But at least so, it attempts to persuade and dissuade me were making no impression on my foolish obstinacy. and she could not bear to offend me. So, amidst deep sighs and tears, she ended in these words: "We shall both be destroyed. All that is left us is suffering as great as our love has been. In this, as the whole world knows, she showed herself a true prophet." And so, when our baby son was born, we entrusted him to my sister's care and returned secretly to Paris. A few days later, after a night's private vigil of prayer in a certain church at dawn, we were joined in matrimony in the presence of Fulbert and some of his and our friends. Afterwards, we parted secretly and went our ways unobserved. Subsequently, our meetings were few and furtive in order to conceal as far as possible what had done. But Fulbert and his household, seeking satisfaction for the dishonor done to him, began to spread the news of the marriage and break the promise of secrecy they had given me. Alois cursed them and swore that there was no truth in this, and in his exasperation, Fulbert heaped abuse on her on several occasions. As soon as I discovered this, I removed her to a convent of nuns in this town near Paris called Argenteuil, where she had been brought up and educated as a small girl. And I also made for her a religious habit of typing worn by novices with the exceptions of the veil, and made her put it on. At this news, her uncle and his kinsmen and followers imagined that I had tricked them and had found an easy way of ridding myself of Alois by making her a nun. While with indignation they swore an oath against me, and one night, as I slept peacefully in an inner room in my lodgings, they bribed one of my servants to admit them, and there they punished me with the most cruel and shameful vengeance of such appalling barbarity as to shock the world, a whole world. They cut off the parts of my body where I had committed the wrong of which they complained. Then they fled, but the two who could be caught were blinded and castrated as I had been, one of them being the servant who had been led by the greed while in my service to betray his master. Next morning, the whole city gathered before my house, and the scene of horror and amazement mingled with lamentation, cries, and groans, which exasperated and distressed me, is difficult, no impossible to describe. In particular, the clerks and most of all my pupils tormented me with their unbearable weeping and wailing, until I suffered more from their sympathy than from the pain of my wound, and felt the misery of my mutilation less than my shame and humiliation. All sorts of thoughts filled my mind: how brightly my reputation had been shown, and now how easily in an evil moment it has been dimmed, or rather completely blotted out. How just a judgment of God had struck me in the parts of body with which I had sinned, and how just a reprisal had been taken by the very man I had myself betrayed. I thought how my rivals would exult over my fitting punishment, how this bitter blow would bring lasting grief and misery to my friends and parents, and how fast the news of this unheard of disgrace would spread over the whole world. What road could I take now? How could I show my face in public, to be pointed at by every finger, derided by every tongue, monstrous spectacle to all I met? I was also appalled to remember that, according to the cruel letter of the law, a eunuch in such an abomination to the Lord that man made eunuchs by the amputation or mutilation of their member are forbidden to enter church if they were stinking and unclean, and even animals in the state are rejected for sacrifice. Ye shall not present to the Lord any animal if its testicles have been bruised or crushed, torn or cut. No man whose testicles have been crushed or whose organs has been severed shall become a member of the assembly of the Lord. I admit that it was shame and confusion in my remorse and misery rather than my devout wish of conversion which brought me to seek shelter in the monastery cloister. Alois already agreed to take the veil in obedience to my wish and entered to a convent. So we both put the religious habit, I in the abbey of Saint Denis and she in convent of Argenteuil, which I spoke of before. There were many people I remembered whom in pity for her youth tried to dissuade her from the submitting to the yoke of monastic rule as a penance too hard to bear. But in all vain, she broke out as best she could through her tears and sobs into Cornelia famous lament, O noble husband, too great for me to wed, was it my fate to bend that lofty head? What prompted me to marry you and bring about you fall? Now claim your dues, and she me gladly pay. So saying, she hurried to the altar, quickly took up the veil blessed by the bishop, and publicly bound herself to the religious life. I had still scarcely recovered from my wound when the clerks came thronging round to pester the abbot and myself with the repeated demands that I should now, for love of God, continue to study, which hitherto I had pursued only in desire of wealth and fame. They argued me to consider that the talent entrusted to me by God would be required for me with interest. That instead of addressing myself to the rich as before, I should devote myself to educating the poor, and recognize that the hand of the Lord had touched me for express purpose of freeing me from that temptation of the flesh and distraction of the world, so that I could devote myself to learning and thereby prove myself a true philosopher, not of the world but of the God. But the abbey to which I had withdrawn was completely worldly and depraved, and abbot whose preeminent position was matched by his evil living and notorious reputations. On several occasions I spoke out boldly in criticism of their intolerably foul practice, both in private and public, and made myself such a burden and nuisance to them all that they gladly seized on daily importunities of my pupil as a pretext for having me removed from their midst. As pressure continued for some time and these demands became insistent, my abbot and the monk intervened, and I retired to a cell where I could devote myself to teaching as before, and there my pupil gathered in crowd until there were too many for the place for to hold or the land to support. I applied myself mainly to the study of scripture as being most suitable to my present calling, but I did not wholly abandon the instructions in the profane art in which I had better practiced and which was most expected to me. In fact, I used it as a hook baited with the taste of philosophy to draw my listener towards the study of true philosophy, the practice of greatest Christian philosophers, as recorded by the Eusebius in his History of the Christian Church. When it became apparent that God had granted me the gift of interpreting the scriptures as well as secular literature, the number in my school began to increase for both subjects, while elsewhere they diminished rapidly. This aroused the envy and hatred of the other heads of the school against me. They set out to disparage me in whatever way they could, and two of them especially were always attacking me behind my back for occupying myself with the secular literature in a manner totally unsuitable to my monastic calling, and for presuming to set up the teacher of sacred learning when I had no teacher myself. Their aim was of everything for teaching in the school to be forbidden, and for this end they were always trying to win over archbishop, abbots, in fact any one of the count in the church whom they could approach. Now it happened that I first applied myself to lecturing on the basis of our faith by analogy with human reason, and composed a theological treatise on divine unity and trinity for the use of my students who were asking for human and logical reason for this subject and demand something intelligible rather than mere words. In fact, they said that words were useless if the intelligence could not follow them, and that nothing could be believed unless it was first understood, and it was absurd for anyone to preach to others that neither nor those he taught could grasp the understanding. The Lord himself has criticized such blind guided for blind man. After the treatise had been seen and read by many people, it began to please everyone, and it seems to answer all questions alike on this subject. It was generally agreed that the question were peculiarly difficult, and the importance of the problem was matched by the subtlety of my solution. My rivals were therefore much annoyed and conveyed A council against me, prompted by my two old opponents, Alberic and Lotuf, who now that our former masters, Williams and Anselm, were dead, were trying to reign alone in their place and succeed them as their hire. Both of them were head of the school in Reims, and thereby repeated insinuations they were able to influence their Archbishop Ralph to take action against me, and along with Canon, Bishop of Palestrina, who held the office of papal legates in France at the time, to convene an assembly, which they called council, in the city of Soissons, where I was to be invited to come bringing my treatise on the Trinity. This was done, but before I could make my appearance, my two rivals spread such evil rumor about me amongst the clerks and people that I and few people who had accompanied me narrow escaped being stoned by the people on the first day we arrived, for having preached and written so they had been told, and there were three gods. I called on the legate as soon as I entered the town, handed him a copy of the treatise for him to read, informs an opinion, and declared myself ready to receive correction and make amends if